Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan features two radio professionals with over 100 years of broadcasting experience between them. Dave Hogan and Randy Houston are both native Western North Carolinians whose rich voices have been heard in every glade, cove, and holler of Western North Carolina and East Tennessee, primarily on AM radio. And between the two of them, they've worked in just about every radio format. As you can imagine, these guys have tons of stories about the day-to-day of live radio and the interactions they've had with listeners and entertainers while they were immersed in, at the time, one of the most influential and informative mediums available. Those experiences will be featured in this podcast series. Check the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts with Randy and Dave on Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan. I'm Randy Houston.
Great balls of fire. Hogan here from Hogan Holler.
He's wound
A
up
whole
today.
lot of shaking going on here in the holler today.
Going to talk about...
Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee passed away just recently. And there are a lot of stories about Jerry Lee, and I've got a couple of personal stories, personal relationships that I've had with, or contacts I've had with Jerry Lee that I'll tell you about. Did you ever meet the killer?
No, I never did. Heard lots of stories, though.
You know, I was promoting these country shindigs at the Asheville City Auditorium. And I got a call one day from Bobby Denton over at WIVK in Knoxville, who they were also promoting country shindigs. I stole their name for the ones in Asheville, matter of fact. And Bobby says, you ought to book Jerry Lee Lewis. Well, you know, you've heard so many wild stories about Jerry Lee. You've heard that he's such a hellraiser, and
Right.
And that's true, apparently, in a lot of cases. So I was very hesitant about booking Jerry Lee Lewis for a show. But he had just had maybe his second country music hit at the time. Another Time was the first one, I believe. And then I believe She Even Woke Me Up to Say Goodbye was the second one, if I recall correctly. And so he was beginning to get some traction in the country music field after several years of struggling to get his music played on the radio because of all the controversy that has surrounded him through the years, marrying his first cousin at 13 years old, things like that. But I went ahead and I booked Jerry Lee Lewis, and I have no idea what to attribute this to. He was as nice and gentlemanly, courteous as he could possibly be.
You're kidding.
Exactly. And not only on that occasion, but the second time I booked him, it was the same way.
Really?
And then the third time that I met Jerry Lee was when he did a show at the Country Palace, which is now the Orange Peel in Asheville. And I didn't promote the show, but I went there and spent some time with him. In fact, he hired a young man, I believe his name is Randy Porche, while he was in Asheville. He was short a guitar player. I can't remember if it was the bass player or... And Randy happened to be there, and just, I don't know how he was able to fall in with the band. And he hired him on the spot, took him on the road with him. And his dad, David Porche, was my barber. And you see what a mess he did with my hair up here.
What? You had a barber?
At one time, believe it or not, I had a barber. So like I said, Jerry Lee was just as nice, and couldn't ask for a nicer person to be around every time I've been around him.
Boy, the stories that are to the contraire, they abound. I've mentioned it before. I had a real good friend named Gino Rumple. Spelled his name Ginorumple. Gino Rumple. He always said, if you don't like your name, just change it. He was a record rep that called on me as the program director of a radio station, wanting me to play the records at their company. And he had done that all his life. And at one time, he was a rep for Mercury Records. And one of the artists that he had in the Mercury Records stable was
Jerry Lee Lewis.
And he told stories. He told stories. I'm telling you.
Of course, you don't have to exaggerate much, but I'm sure that Jerry Lee's the kind of person that lended himself to a lot of exaggeration.
Yeah.
He was his nature.
He was ready for it.
But he did shoot one of his band members accidentally one time. There's controversy. There was controversy at the time whether it was an accident or not. Shot him in the leg. I mean, he's been involved in so many things. And, of course, after he had his big rock and roll explosion back in the 50s with a whole lot of shaking going on, great balls of fire, he married his 13-year-old first cousin, and that just about killed his career. And he had flown to England with Myra, his wife. They got their marriage license by having an older lady go with Jerry Lee to stand in for her when they bought the license, because they figured that if they saw her at 13 years old,
wouldn't do it.
They wouldn't get the license. But anyway, Jerry Lee has two famous cousins, or had two famous cousins, Mickey Gilley and the Reverend Jimmy Swaggart, first cousins. But he had another first cousin named J.W. Brown. And J.W. Brown was quite a renowned musician in North Mississippi and Memphis and that area. Jerry Lee's first cousin back in the 50s. And J.W. hired Jerry Lee to play piano in his band. And then he lived with J.W. Brown and family, and that's where he became involved with J.W.'s daughter, Myra, at 13 years old.
Gotcha.
As I said, that just about killed his career, but he made a comeback in the world of country music later on. Funny story here, before I forget it. When J.W., Myra's father, found out that Jerry Lee had married his daughter at 13 years old, he was incensed. He was really, really, really mad. Meantime, he was the one who took Jerry Lee up to Sun Records and got acquainted with Sam Phillips. So he, to a great extent, is responsible for Jerry Lee becoming the big star. But when he found out that Jerry Lee had married Myra, he knew Jerry Lee, or thought Jerry Lee, would be up at the Sun Studios in Memphis. And he called up there, and Sam Phillips answered the phone. And he said, Sam, this is J.W. Is Jerry Lee there? Yeah, he's here. Well, I'm coming up there to kill that son of a bitch. So Sam hurriedly put Jerry Lee on an airplane.
Out of town.
To get him out of town. But, boy, the stories surrounding Jerry Lee Lewis are abundant. And his last, Jerry Lee was married 8 times.
8 times.
8 times. Now, one of his wives he had married twice because he had married this particular wife before being divorced from the previous wife. So he had to go through the ceremony again. So I guess that means 7 different wives, but 8 marriages. And believe it or not, his sister Linda Gale has also been married 8 times. But she married Lovelace, Kenny Lovelace, I believe was his name, who had a band that backed up the Wilburn Brothers for a long time. I'm getting confused here. I'm not sure of this. But anyway, she married the same fella twice.
Like Jerry Lee married.
Yeah.
Same woman.
But I guarantee you that's a record of a brother and a sister
16.
having 16 marriages. I don't think you'll beat that.
Well, one of the stories that Gino used to tell, and I've quoted this several times, is that he said that getting Jerry Lee to an event, a record signing, an autograph signing, a concert, he's getting him to that event on time, sober and ready to go, like he'd agreed to do, was a headache. And he said he was constantly, come on, Jerry Lee, come on, we got to be there in 5 minutes. Come on, Jerry Lee, come on, you got to get dressed. We got to be there in 5 minutes. And he said one of the comments that Jerry Lee would always come back at him with was, there ain't a damn thing going to happen till I get there. So hush.
Yeah, I can believe it. Back to my first encounter with Jerry Lee up at the old Asheville Civic Center, Asheville Auditorium, rather, before the Civic Center was built. And it seated, I believe, 3,200. So I would generally book 2 shows, a matinee and an evening performance, in order to be able to expand that to 6,400 people. And sometimes in the business of promotion, you would make a little money on one show, and then you'd book Buck Owens and lose a bunch of money,
Ooh.
which I did.
Oh, gosh.
Buck just about ran me out of the promotion business.
Really?
And I found out later, Buck, when I booked Buck, every record was number 1. And I had to stand in line to book him because he was so popular. But I found out later that east of the Mississippi River, he couldn't draw flies.
He was a California guy, wasn't he?
West of the Mississippi, he was a big star.
Yeah.
As far as personal appearance, now his records may have sold in the East, but as far as personal appearances are concerned, he just didn't draw. And I've had other promoters tell me this. He just didn't draw crowds.
After the fact. Oh, I know that had to hurt.
Yeah.
But Jerry Lee.
Okay, back to the story I started to tell.
Yeah.
The first time that Jerry Lee Lewis came to Asheville on one of my shows that I promoted, the Reverend Harris, Robert E. Harris, asked me if he could come backstage and meet Jerry Lee Lewis. Tell people who Reverend Robert Harris was.
Reverend Robert E. Harris was the night watch pastor on local radio for many, many years on 570 WWNC. He took a live call-in show. I believe it was at 9 o'clock at night, and he was a Bible scholar. He would take these calls about people who wanted to know everything in the world about the Bible. He also later on became the circuit riding preacher, and he rode around Western North Carolina mountains holding revivals on horseback. And he was an entrepreneur, a businessman in Asheville, also operated the Westgate Drive-In Church for many years. Reverend Robert E. Harris, the night watch. I had a
devotional on my Sunday morning hymn time program, and he was doing that program at the time we're talking about when I booked Jerry Lee Lewis. So he asked me if he could come up. He'd like to meet Jerry Lee Lewis. I said, sure, come on backstage. Come on. I told him where to enter without having to pay, back to the rear of the auditorium. And I met him there. And he went into the dressing room where Jerry Lee was small dressing rooms, where Jerry Lee was. I introduced the two. And Jerry Lee was very cordial to Reverend Harris. Well, at that time, Linda Gale, Jerry Lee's sister, was opening for his shows. And she, of course, at that time was young, pretty, had long legs, and was wearing short shorts this particular night. Very short shorts. She walked into the dressing room when Jerry Lee was talking to the Reverend Robert Harris.
In the short shorts.
She did. She walked in with the short shorts, and Jerry Lee turned around and said, "You get out of here dressed like that. What do you mean come in here dressed like that with a preacher in here?" And of course, Linda Gill had a puzzled look on her face, and she turned and ran like a scalded dog and got out of there. I'll always remember that.
Preacher Harris.
Yeah.
We talked about him earlier, I think, on here, but Jerry Lee Lewis was such a character, and the music style, the piano playing of those cousins you talked about. Honest to goodness, Dave, there's a flutter on the keyboards of all three of those guys that will tell you that they're blood relatives. There's a signature. There's a way they play the piano or played the piano. It was, you heard it. You heard that.
Nothing like it.
Nothing.
You know, Jerry Lee was sent to Bible school by his mother when he became an adult. And he was caught playing "My God Is Real" with boogie woogie style. You know that great old song, "My God Is Real, I Can Feel It in My Soul."
Right.
And Jerry Lee was playing it Jerry Lee style on the piano and got kicked out of the Bible school. Or else he might have been a preacher alongside his first cousin, Jimmy. Jerry Lee and Jimmy Lee.
Well, Jimmy Lee is still going, right?
Yes.
He's
and not long before Jerry Lee died, they got together and recorded some gospel songs.
That's right. You sent me one.
And of course, Jerry Lee's unable to play the piano. He'd put one hand up there and
he chorded. He just
do a few things, but he couldn't play the piano. But and in fact, I saw Jimmy Swaggart quoted as saying that he wasn't sure that Jerry Lee would be able to make it through the session. And if you're interested in listening to Jerry Lee and his first cousin, you can go online to YouTube and just Google Jerry Lee Lewis and Reverend Jimmy Swaggart, and you'll see some of the songs they recorded together not too long before Jerry Lee died. And of course, Jerry Lee was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, I think, 3 days before he died?
Yeah.
He was unable to make the trip and be there in person, and Chris Christopherson took him his hardware,
award,
so to speak,
down
to his ranch in northern Mississippi. Nesbitt, I believe, is the name of the town. The second time that I booked Jerry Lee Lewis, it was pretty curious. Again, he was very accommodating, nice to be around, easy to talk to. But he was, at that time, he was engulfed in listening to Luke the Drifter. You remember Luke the Drifter, the things that Hank Williams did under that name? A lot of recitations like "Beyond the Sunset" and "Be Careful of Stones That You Throw." Luke the Drifter.
Yeah, I've not listened to those, but
you need to go back and listen to them.
I will.
But he was obsessed at that time. So he came into the backstage when he arrived at the City Auditorium in Asheville with a portable record player.
A real record player. And he looked around and found a place to plug it in. Found an electrical outlet, plugged it in, and sat there for the better part of the evening when he wasn't on stage, listening to records by Luke the Drifter. And he'd say, "Come over here and listen to this." So I'd go over there and put my ear down to listen to that. That's real soul, Jerry Lee would say. That's real soul. And he was right. That's pretty amazing. And to think about in today's world, when we've got Bluetooth, AirPods, we've got MP3s, we got Amazon Music, and to think about hauling around a portable record player with records and playing them to listen to music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that's another Jerry Lee Lewis story that I will always remember. And when he went over to England, he was virtually lynched. They got him out of there because they were afraid harm would come to him. The press was all over him, and it's pretty miraculous when you look back at that time that he was able to revive his career and become the star that he was. But and also, we fail to remember, we forget that, or maybe people didn't know that Jerry Lee and Linda Gale were married for 13 years. They had a pretty long marriage.
You mean his
Myra.
Yeah.
Myra.
Yeah.
Sorry, I said Linda Gale because we've been talking about her.
Yeah.
But he and Myra were married for 13
years.
years. Yeah. And I understand that Jerry Lee tried on a couple of occasions to get her back, and she wouldn't go back.
After they divorced?
Yeah, after they divorced. And they had, I believe, 2 children, and one of them, a young boy, drowned in a swimming pool. So
really?
They had some tragedy there.
Wow.
And Linda Gale went on to, after she left touring with Jerry Lee, went on to do quite a bit of work on her own. She was never a superstar like her brother, but she had quite a good career. Hooked up with Van Morrison, did some stuff, and was pretty good talent.
So that music, we all know, it is in the genes. It is in the genes. Mickey Gilley and of course Jimmy Swaggart, no stranger to controversy too. Just like cousin Jerry Lee, anyway, he kind of got in trouble too. But in the later years, or matter of fact, in the last 10 years, I thought I've seen Jimmy Swaggart back on TV.
Oh, yeah, RFD Network.
Okay, that's where
No.
No?
Is that right? No, I think he has his own network. I can't remember what.
I can't either.
What he calls it, but he's on if you've got cable, you'll probably be able to find it.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is handled by his son.
Okay.
Yeah, Reverend Swaggart's son is now basically the host of the TV show.
Well,
great music, I'll tell you that.
Exactly what you took the words right out of my mouth. What stopped me on the channel surfing was the music. When you hear that music.
If you want to hear good gospel music, you go to an Assembly of God Pentecostal church.
Amen.
And you'll hear some great gospel music.
Clapping on the offbeat, 2 and 4. Yes. Ain't nothing like it. When I was doing sound for a gospel quartet for a while, we had one church particularly that we stopped at in Augusta, Georgia. And it was a Pentecostal church. And I never enjoyed the music anywhere like I enjoyed it right there in Augusta, Georgia. Great music.
Jerry Lee's last wife, who was with him when he died. Now listen to this, talking about Jerry Lee and his family and the cousins and so forth. Jerry Lee's last wife was married at one time to Myra's brother. Think about that.
Okay.
So Jerry Lee married Myra's
married his
brother-in-law.
That's so. I'm my own grandpa. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm telling you that quite a family, and there's some also. You talked about YouTube. You showed me this before. There's some YouTube stuff on that Lewis family. A matter of fact, one of them, the title says, "Don't mess with the Lewis family."
Only they use a different 4-letter word than mess.
Yeah, we don't.
We don't use it here on this podcast. But it's funny to watch. It's Jerry Lee's another sister, Frankie. And Frankie and her husband down in Faraday, Louisiana, Frankie died a couple of years ago, owned a drive-through liquor and convenience store. Big sign up out front says no walk-throughs. You got to drive through. Stay in your car and tell them what you want, and they'll bring it to you, right? So this Norwegian film crew came over to do some stories about the American South. And in reading about it, they claim they discovered it by accident, but it may have been somebody tipped them off to it as something they'd enjoy filming. So they went down there and they filmed the program that you can pull up on YouTube. Don't mess with the Lewises. And it is hilarious. And next door to their store is a house that Jerry Lee at one time lived in. Frankie made it into a museum with all kind of photos and memorabilia and things regarding Jerry Lee Lewis.
So
it's funny to listen to Frankie describe her brother Jerry Lee. I'm not going to give it away. Just
go.
I'll backtrack a little bit. I mentioned Kenny Lovelace earlier. He was one of Linda Gale's husbands. I'm looking at a list of her husbands. Too long to read. But I knew there was a Lovelace in there. And she married him twice. So, like Jerry Lee, she was married 8 times, but only had 7 different husbands.
Dave, I find it fascinating. You've crossed paths with Jerry Lee Lewis on 3 different occasions, worked together, and you had no troubles, and it all went well, and you might have made a buck or two.
As I recall, did make a little money on Jerry Lee, but lost it with Buck Owens.
That's the way it goes. Huh?
You know, I can remember the only time that I really had to turn people away was a George Jones show.
Really?
And in this particular case, it was on a Sunday. The only date that I could get that would work with George's schedule, there was like a 3:00 Sunday afternoon matinee and another show Sunday night at 8. Both, and it snowed. I mean, it was cold, blustery, and you know how windy it is in downtown Asheville?
Absolutely.
Wind whipping through there in front of that auditorium, and I was on pins and needles all day.
Of course.
Because I knew that, and George, was a pretty expensive act. And Tammy was with him. George and Tammy were together at that time. And had to turn people away, both shows.
Oh, man.
Sold out.
Thank you so much. We're gonna come back in our next episode and talk about some more of these giants of the industry that are gone.
Exactly, and Mickey Gilley, which we've referenced, is one of them. We're going to talk about the artists that we've lost in 2022, those who have passed on, when we come back on our next podcast.
Well, I look forward to it. Thank you all so much for joining us on Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan.
Be sure to click the subscribe button for another episode of Hot Mic with Randy Houston and Dave Hogan.